Hey guys, so here's the notes for 7.7 day 1. We are going to continue to solve right triangles. Now, what we have doing so far is we've been solving the sides of a right triangle, and we've used numerous ways to do so. So let's kind of list those out, okay? So solving right triangles, okay? So we've been trying to solve the sides. So finding the measure of the sides. So some of the ways that we've done it is we use the Pythagorean theorem. Then we talked about in 7.3 our altitude and leg theorems. Then 7.4 we talked about those 45, 45, 90 and 30, 60, 90 triangles. So Pythagorean theorem was when we did 7.1, this was 7.3, and this was 7.4. Then in 7.5 and 7.6, we talked about trig ratios. So this was our SOHCAHTOA. So our sine, cosine, and tangent. So this was 7.5 and 7.6. Okay. Now, basically, we've always been finding the measures of the sides of right triangles. Today, we're going to be talking about how do we actually find missing angle measurements, okay? So to find missing angle measurements, of right triangles, we are going to use what is called inverse trig ratios, okay? So what does this look like? Okay, well, let's talk about all the trig ratios we talked about, right? So we had tangent, okay? The inverse of it is going to look something like this. Okay, then we talked about sine and then cosine. Those are going to look like this. Now, you might be wondering, well, what is that -1? Is that really saying like tangent to the negative first? No, not really. It's really saying inverse tangent or inverse sine or inverse cosine. So that's what the -1 represents. So we say inverse tan, inverse sine, and inverse cosine. Okay, so it's not really taking it to the negative first power. It's just how we write and talk about inverse. Okay, now, if we got really into trig, we would use the word arc, like arc tangent, arc sine, arc cosine, but don't worry about that. We're just going to say inverse. So we always use the inverse trig ratios to find missing angle measurements of right triangles. So for 7.7 day 1, we are just going to make sure that we know how to plug this into our calculator. Because just like we did with trig ratios, we have to use our calculator to actually get the measure amount. We got to do that with our angles. Okay, let's kind of go back here. So I basically talked about all of this. So here's our angle measurement. So here says the expression tangent, and you see the negative first of x. Really what that is read as the inverse tangent of x. So you're going to hear me say that quite a bit with all the trig ratios. So we have basically tangent, sine, or cosine of an angle, and we have to find this missing angle. We are going to move that ratio over to the other side and take the inverse of it. So let's go ahead and try that for our first example here. So it says use an inverse tangent to find an angle measurement, okay? So here we are trying to find the measure of angle x. So I'm going to go ahead and label my triangle because I still have to use the trig ratio to do so. And we have to use a calculator to approximate the measure of it, okay? So I'm going to label my x. I'm going to do that here. Okay. Now, I'm going to see, notice I have a 5 and a 7 on my sides. So I have to use that in order to solve for x. So notice that 5 is the side right next to x. Remember, that means that is our adjacent side. And 7 is across from the x, so that is our opposite. So how I'm going to do this is I keep my tangent. Now, usually we did the angle measurement, but that's what we're trying to find. So actually here I'm going to do tangent, and then x equals, and I'm going to set up my fraction. Here we have to do adjacent over opposite, okay? So remember, when we are doing this, actually that's opposite over adjacent, excuse me. So remember for SOHCAHTOA, we have TOA. So we have opposite over adjacent. So our opposite side is 7, and then we have a 5. Now, in order to get x all by itself, I need to move tangent over to the other side. So when I do that, it becomes the inverse. So I have tangent, I do that -1, and then I have 7/5. And notice I'm putting parentheses. So every single time, put parentheses around that value. So when I move that trig ratio to solve for the variable, move it over, and it becomes the inverse. Now, we are going to go ahead and plug this into our calculator. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So this is how we're going to plug it into our calculator here, okay? Okay, so notice we have a second. That kind of just changes. You see some of these numbers in blue. So we want the inverse. Notice that above the tangent button, we have that tangent to the -1st. That is our inverse button. So I'm going to press second first and then press the tangent, and it becomes inverse. Now I put that 7/5, and then I press enter, and it gives me my value. Now make sure when you're doing this, you are in degree mode. In order to do that, remember you have to go to mode and make sure that your degree is highlighted. If it's not, just go down and then go to the right and press enter to make sure it's highlighted. Then we do second mode to quit, okay? And notice up here, it does say degree, so I know I'm in degree mode. So here, our answer is going to be that 54. Now, notice it tells us where to round to. It says to the nearest 10th of a degree. Make sure you follow instructions if it tells you where to round to. So we have 54 point. Now, notice after the 4, we have a 6, so we need to round up. So we have 54.5. And this is an angle measurement, so we do degrees. So now that's our new unit, degrees, to represent that angle. Okay, make sure you come back for the next video for 7.7 day 1. We are then going to do example 2 and basically just make sure we know how to calculate sine, cosine, and tangent of the inverse.